Hey, Jennifer Walden here for soundeffect.com. This special interview with multi-award-winning supervising sound editor, sound designer, re-recording mixer Craig Henighan is for AirCon, an online conference about sound for film, games, and beyond, featuring 50 plus talks, AMA panels, and interviews. AirCon takes place June 5th through the 16th, 2023 at airwiggles.com/AirCon. And good news, the conference is completely free and open to everyone around the globe. AirCon is a partnership between Airwiggles and a sound effect. Hey, Craig, thank you so much for being here.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Jen. Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for asking me and stoked on anything to talk about audio and you guys putting on a free conference and stuff is great. I mean, these kind of resources are just amazing for, up and coming sound designers and sound folk in general. So thank you.
Yeah, and we're just so thrilled to have talented sound people like yourself here to give your expert advice. Your sound work on Love, Death, and Robots is incredible. It's won Emmy and MPSE awards. It consistently earns Best Sound Editing nominations for both. So, since it's an anthology series, right, each episode is completely different. So, how do you stay on your toes creatively to meet each episode with the same creative enthusiasm? Like, do you ever face creative burnout, and how do you get through that?
That's a really good question. For Love, Death, and Robots, I only do the odd one here and there every season. I'm not on every single one of them. Brad North, a colleague of mine who I work with quite often, he's sort of like spearheads the show, and I kind of get, I get called for, I guess I probably get called for more of the juicier ones, or the ones that sort of, the sound design is maybe a little deeper than some of the other ones. If you've seen the series, they're quite varied in what they do and what they
Yeah.
accomplish, and which is the part of the charm, I think, of the anthology. But my involvement has been like, oh yeah, hey Craig, you can do this one because it's like, robotic spiders that are crawling out of the walls and all that kind of stuff. So Brad always gives me a heads up and allows me sort of like, hey, we got this one coming up a few months from now. Can you start thinking about sounds and stuff like that? So that's sort of the first approach, honestly, is just how do you avoid creative burnout is a really great question, I think, for everybody in any industry, but definitely in sound, especially as a freelancer. You're sort of like, you gotta kind of strike when it's hot, and I think a lot of it for me is the push and pull of like really deep creative work, and then sort of step away and sort of like let it sort of simmer for a little bit. Schedules don't always sort of allow for that sort of thing where you can kind of work deeply creatively and then step away. But something like Love, Death, and Robots, and being that I kind of work with Brad and I also work with Tim Miller, who's one of the creators of the project, they give me a lot of latitude to sort of figure stuff out, and I do a lot of mixing and then editing and sound design sort of all in my own studio. So I can kind of like trial and error some stuff. Experimentation's a big thing. But honestly, the burnout thing, I think it's just about pushing past it on some levels, and just thinking about like, you got to start. You just have to start someplace. And every project, we start with a blank work screen, whether it's Pro Tools or Reaper or whatever, format you're using. You just got to start, and I think some designers that I work with, can feel like they're overwhelmed with like, it needs to be the best thing right away, and that's not necessarily the journey. The journey and the experimentation is sort of where it can lead stuff, and quite often I'll just put sounds in and I'll make a bunch of markers, and that's kind of just sort of start. I have tons and tons of like pieces of paper jotted with like adjectives of notes of stuff I want to record or things I kind of want to like look at, sort of references maybe on something I've heard, and I think all those things together sort of help you sort of push through any sort of, um, you know, mental block or whatever. The other thing is sometimes start with the easy stuff, right? You know, if you look at a sequence and you get overwhelmed by it, you're like, oh my God, I got to do these little robotic spiders. And then the giant robotic spiders got to show up. And then there's all these guns. And then there's this, you know, giant creature with chains hanging off, like one of the episodes that I did last season, in Vaulted Halls. So you sort of just have to start with kind of what you know, maybe, you know, on some levels, and just like, you know, I quite often I'll start with backgrounds. I'll start with atmospheric, and what that allows me to do is sort of build the world. And when I was coming up, I learned really early that the foundation of any really good sound job, for instance, or soundtrack, is making sure that the backgrounds and the atmospheres kind of like convey the right feeling and vibe and story and stuff, you know. So I still to this day start there. And what that allows me to do is work on that. And while I'm working on that, I'm sort of looking at the images and I'm dropping marker notes. I'm jotting down little notes on my, you know, works pad or whatever, and just sort of like slowly sort of submerge yourself into the project, you know. And but sometimes just starting with the easy stuff kind of gets the ball rolling.
Awesome. So Stranger Things is one of the shows that you're more deeply involved in. You know, not like Love, Death, and Robots, where you're kind of like feature sound designer.
Yes. I sub in, right.
Yeah. So you won a bunch of Emmys for Stranger Things. Is it four Emmys now?
I believe 4 or 5. I think like
Five.
four editing, one mixing, I believe, and stuff. Yeah, I've been look, the show is just awesome, and I've been incredibly fortunate. Great team around me. Matt and Ross Duffer are great guys. But yeah, it's been quite a ride since season 1, that's for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, great show, and consistently sounds amazing. So how do you grow the sound of the show so that it has that same Stranger Things flavor, but it kind of evolves as the show evolves? Is there any tips to share on how to create new sounds that are kind of in the same vein and fit a world, but are still unique and cool?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think since the beginning in season 1, a lot of the Stranger Things DNA was sort of, I kind of came up with that first season, you know, and just like anything, you know, things kind of grow and evolve and get bigger, and sound just sort of has to follow suit, you know. And you look to season 4, and you know, the guys want it all. They want Metallica, and they want Kate Bush huge, and then they want the Demogorgons massive, and then they want, you know, the Upside Down to be bigger. So everything sort of slowly grows and sort of compounds on top of itself, you know. What I tend to sort of try to maintain is still a sense of clarity, right? You know, in a sense of like, because the scenes are shot, you know, if you look at season 1 versus season 4, even like rhythmically, the DNA of how stuff is shot and performed is there, but it's a lot. The action is just bigger, you know, like, you know, we got Hopper with a Demogorgon in a Russian prison, you know, and we got a clock that is just like omnipresent. We have a bad guy named Vecna that's sort of, you know, all these things need to live in the sort of Stranger Things world. It's really about looking at what sort of like is the DNA of any sort of specific scene. Like the Upside Down, for instance, is, you know, season 1 for sure is kind of where version 1 of the Upside Down was sort of like figured out. And then you cut to season 4, and it's in the show a lot longer periods of time. They're walking around in the Upside Down a lot longer. So the cool thing in this season was to sort of like a lot of my editors that I work with, I'm like, okay, you know, go work on the Upside Down. Here are the core sounds. Here are the core elements of what you know was created in the first couple seasons, but have your own spin on it. I'm a really big fan of letting sound designers that I work with sort of like, here's the framework, but then go figure it out, make, you know, and I can kind of like, because before everything goes to the mix stage, it kind of goes through me effects wise, right? So I can kind of sort of be a barometer a little bit of like, oh, that's really awesome, let's employ that a little bit more, or let's pull back and let's retain a little bit more of what the Demogorgon should have sounded like from the beginning, you know. So but it's not easy. I'll give, you know, it's not easy to sort of like look at a show like Stranger Things and figure out what needs to be playing at any one moment is kind of probably the biggest thing. And that's actually in the mixing side of it, right? So if you look at sound effects as the creative side, and we have all these cool things, and I work a lot, Matt and Ross and our lead picture editor, Dean Zimmerman, they do it a tremendous, and Casey and all the other editors in the picture department, they do a really good Avid track, especially now getting into season 4 and now coming into season 5, they have all our sounds from the first couple seasons. So they kind of know, like, oh, Craig made this thing back in season 1. Let's use that, but then we'll strangerize it some more, or we'll turbocharge it some more, So next thing you know, I got like layers of, the guys are big fans of stings, and they're a big fan of like, that sort of risers and all those kind of things. But you look at what season 1 was built in, and you look at, like, well, now you guys have just stacked like 6 risers in one Avid track, so we get that and go, God, how are we going to figure this out? Because it's already sounding very Stranger Things, so it's about just picking it apart, figuring out the DNA of what they like, and then fleshing it all out, and I got to give a lot of credit to Mark and Will as well in the final mix. They have a heck of a job with all the music that shows up, all the dialogue, all the sound effects, the sort of mixing dance that they need to do, is pretty incredible to make this show sing. And then the length of the shows, Jen, are, this last past season were like, I didn't really believe them when I would see them, a little bit here and there early on, while they were shooting, and Dean would call me. He's like, it's pretty big, man. They're long episodes. And I never really sort of like registered, like they were going to be like 2.5, like the last episode, chapter 9 this season was like 2.5 hours long, and the quality needs to be the highest it can be. And that's not just sound, that's every department needs to be at that level, and so when you work at a show like that and you have the great team that I have around me and everybody's bringing their A-list game, that's kind of how a show like that can kind of jump out of the speakers. Is kind of that's probably the biggest thing that I try to explain to, everyone that I work with, is I literally want the show to sort of jump out of the speakers. And the brothers, Matt and Ross, they're such huge fans of sound and music, and they know what the power of it, so they allow us the time. They really do.
Yeah, it's really important to have that time. You're working on feature length episodes 100%. Of a show.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. It's almost like a new paradigm. I feel like there's that whole, it's technically not a feature, and it's technically not a TV show anymore. It's sort of like this. They're definitely pushing. I think Game of Thrones was doing it a bit, or is doing it a bit. And there are those series out there that are like, why does it need to be an hour? Why can't it be, and the guys, they like the format. They want to tell their stories in 8 or 9 or 10 or 12 or 13 hours. They want that format. They don't necessarily, I'm sure they will do films in the future, but that's not really their focus, Matt and Ross, right now. They want to tell their stories in this format. But God, their format is huge. It's a massive amount of work. God knows what season 5 is going to be. I hear that, it's I think online one of them was saying, like, if season 1 and season 4 had a baby, it would be what season 5 is going to be, or something like that. So, very exciting coming up. But we're just incredibly blessed, honestly, that I'm part of that kind of a show, and we have the support and resources to sort of pull it off correctly. So.
Yeah, support and resources and time, because this isn't something you could just whip out. Yeah,
it is. It really is time, and luckily time is the biggest one for sure, because these things take time to experiment, and the whole thing about happy accidents, like when a sound designer is just playing around, and you might be making something for one thing, and then you happen into like 50 other things. And what I learned early on is, like, if you don't follow that, like if you're making, say you're making a bunch of whooshes, or you're making a bunch of stings or risers or whatever you're doing, and you hit upon a few things, don't ever think like, oh, I can go to lunch, or I can come back a couple of days from now because I'll get back to that and be able to create more of those things. You kind of don't. And it's kind of that it's that unspoken, like, God, you just got to stay in it. And next thing you know, you're making, whatever, 25, 30 odd new stings or whatever that you may not use for your show, but you know for sure down the road that stuff will be swimming around in your subconscious, and then it'll eventually come out. You just always got to be making stuff. I feel like you just always got to be, and it doesn't need to be big things and stuff, but as a sound designer, it's like if you're always creating, you're always thinking, and you're always sort of doing those things, I think when the moments come when there's not a lot of time, that's when it actually, all that ideas, all those things come into play, and you can kind of focus and kind of really bang something out at a high level super quick, you know.
Yeah. So, when working on sci-fi sounds, especially like plugins are a big go-to, right? You're playing around with the different settings on plugins, different parameters. But too much processing from like the same plugins or same set of plugins, everything starts to sound so samey. It's like putting ketchup on everything, right? Everything just tastes like ketchup.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, so do you have any like advice or tips or even like words of caution on relying on plugins for creating sci-fi sounds? Like, what are some of the things that you do to keep your sci-fi sounds fresh and interesting?
Oh, that's really good. That's a really good question, because I'm I can go into those modes of like I need every single plugin and I need every single, trying stuff out. I've been there, I think that it's obviously source dependent, and it's obviously kind of what you're working on are the two main things. Obviously, I find a lot of directors and a lot of creatives that I work with don't necessarily like overly processed sounds. They do like it when, and myself and everybody that's sort of part of the larger team I work with, we're all big fans of recording sounds and finding things in the real world. I know it's sort of a cliche that, because everybody sort of says that, oh, I go out and record, natural sounds or organic sounds and stuff. But honestly, that's kind of where it begins. And, taking those things, and I'm a big fan of sort of like trying to do the simplistic approach first. So if I'm looking at creating a creature, or if I'm looking at a monster or something, I try to find sort of a hook. I try to find like some sort of vocal thing if it's a monster, or some sort of like repetitive thing that I feel I can hang everything else around, and kind of like that's with the Demogorgon and Stranger Things. That was sort of the first thing in season 1, was trying to find something that would be memorable enough and creepy enough and sort of scary enough that I could frame other things around it, and it would always harken back to this same sound, So, but I went through in that instance, I did go through the whole like, okay, I gotta like, I gotta use this plugin, and I gotta use this pitch plugin, and then I gotta stretch it, and I gotta sort of like do all these different things, and ultimately you have to go through those things. You just I feel like if you don't, you're sort of closing yourself off. So again, it's like looking for time to experiment with that. And sometimes I put sort of rules on my sounds. Like I'm only going to try to use time expansion and pitch only, or I'm only going to use, sometimes it's the opposite. I'm only going to use plugins and sort of see what I get, honestly, Jen, it's real no hard and fast rules. It's really just like, I find that for the most part, if you go down the rabbit hole of a bunch of plugins, it generally doesn't it doesn't bear a lot of fruit, like it generally doesn't, it doesn't really always pan out. But what it does sometimes is pushes me into another direction for another project down the road, like something else. So it may not be that plugin setting or whatever I'm doing might not work for what I'm looking for right now. But if I come up with some wacky thing that's like, oh, that's an amazing chain. Like in my plugin settings, I just have like, presets of all sorts of, and normally it's named, I'll name it like the short title of whatever the film I'm working on. And then kind of like maybe what reel it was in or what character. It's just how my brain works. It's like, I started before there was a sound miner, and we had like an Excel spreadsheet, and that's where our sounds were. And then we would go and get stuff off of the MO, and our drives were only like, I remember when I first bought my first 9 gigabyte drive, so it's like you didn't have the plethora of sounds and plugins you have nowadays, so you had to kind of figure it out from like what they used to do, which is like the right sound in the right moment is the right thing to sort of do, and plugins can be great, but they can also be a distraction, and they can also, they're not whatever, I don't know what I'm trying to say. They're not like the be all and end all of sound design, I guess, lack of a
Yeah.
better way to sort of describe it. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but that's sort of like that's my relationship with sound, with plugins. Cause God knows I go down and buy everything and sort of try stuff out. And I find the ones that speak to me the quickest and easiest are the sort of the ones that like, it's for me, it's like, I need it to sort of react quickly. And if I don't, I kind of get bored of it. And I know that if I went deeper, I would find a whole plethora of cooler things to do, but it's just the way my brain works. Like, oh, I got to get on to something else, so.
Yeah, you need that instant gratification,
A
right?
little
If it's too
bit.
complex to like manipulate the sounds, and you're just like, okay, move on.
Yeah. And honestly, performance is a big thing. And I feel like performance and character of sounds, I think sometimes that's where plugins can really get that, like they can take that characteristic out of a sound, and I think it's like, that old adage of like, what's the best microphone you have? Well, it's the one I have in my hand right now, and it's not like, but if you can go and record, a sound that maybe sonically or frequency wise isn't that great, but it fits into what you're doing, then that's the right thing, and sound is so subjective. It's such a cool thing because it can be anything and everything and all these awesome things. But within that world, it can be incredibly difficult to sort of hone in on kind of what you kind of want to try to say. And then you think about what your director wants to say and, their subjectivity of what sounds right to them versus what sounds right to you. It's always that back and forth. It's always that journey. It's always being open to like, exploring other things, and sometimes plugins work, sometimes they don't. Generally, it's a combination for me. Generally, it's a combination of plugs, and recording real stuff. Recording into plugins live is something that I like to do,
Yeah.
So if I'm performing a vocal, I like to light them up, and I'll actually perform into the plugin to sort of see what that is versus the post approach where you're sort of playing around with a dry sound, but again, it always comes down to like what I'm trying to accomplish and what's the character of the sound I'm trying to sort of create and what's the sonic space I'm trying to fill up, all those things. But yeah.
So, as a freelance sound designer, you work with a lot of different people all over the place. And, COVID, totally awful. But one thing it did do, it opened the door for remote collaboration, right? So the industry can embrace this way of working, first out of necessity, but now a lot of sound designers are choosing to work this way. So, what's been some of the benefits of remote collaboration and what's been some of the challenges? And also, like, what impact has remote collaboration had on the sound community and the way that it's expanded, how many people can work on a project together?
Yeah, no, I mean, all those things it's a very interesting time for sure. I spent a lot of time, as a freelancer, I spent a lot of time on a studio lot, over close to 10 years. And I was part of that sort of like the editorial building, and you go and water, you can go in coffee break or tea time and talk about stuff, and editors can come in and supervisors and the directors on the lot and the picture editorials on the lot. So I was part of that for a long time. And then I also built a studio at home because I tend to travel a fair bit. I tend to do a lot of projects in New York and other places. And then when COVID hit, I basically said to a lot of my team, I was like, okay, well, do you have a rig? Do you need a rig? How do we get you set up at home? How do we get you set up at home in a room that's trustworthy? That's probably the biggest thing I felt like is that, you're setting up in a bedroom or something is one thing, but if you can't sort of like have a frame of reference of like how your sounds are working and what level you're sort of cutting at, it can kind of like subconsciously you start cutting things and doing stuff differently because you're not sort of in a proper sort of editorial room, so those are sort of the little things that a lot of people don't talk about is just sort of like how your brain works when you're in an environment that makes it feel like the sounds that are coming out of the speakers are inspiring and stuff, but I think it's always I think from now on it's probably going to be a combo, right? Like I think it's going to be something. I know personally I like to work remote. I think a lot of sound people are in general loners, I don't mean, like, for lack of a better word. I think a lot of us like to sort of be on our own and create sounds, at least part one of it, and then part two of it and part three of it are sort of the collaboration side of it, and then obviously the final mix of it. I think remote allows really good editors to sort of like work at their own schedule, and not have to, the regular everyday life. God, in here in Los Angeles, just the commutes alone, if an editor is driving in from Simi Valley or something, and they're an hour in the car there, and so by the time they get there, they're mentally maybe not quite where they need to be. And are they really doing the best work? Are you really getting the best work with them? Are you inspiring them, or are they just sort of distracted because they've been commuting for so long? It's a lot of those sort of things. It's like the life stuff, but I think it's a question of trusting your editors, trusting people that you work with, that they're actually are working, and that they are actually doing good stuff. I generally, the way I like to work, if I'm supervising and sort of like the head guy, everybody's tracks sort of go through me. And and I quite often mix all my own projects as well, so I have that benefit of like, here's the mix template, and I don't expect you to add reverbs and start EQing and all that kind of stuff. But if you're cutting in the template, at least when I get it, then I know that where my stuff is, and I can kind of like start doing early premixes or early sort of versions of stuff. Then that session goes back to them, and they can kind of see what I'm doing. So it's kind of this really cool back and forth. I did it, I used to do it on the lot as well, but now it's just sort of remote, right? So you Aspera stuff back and forth, a lot of Zooms, a lot of phone calls. And I give the guys a lot of freedom as well. A lot of the sound people that I work with, I give them a lot of freedom to sort of like, I need this and this by then, but up until then, it's your thing. You can do whatever. And we have crunch times. We have all that. Stranger Things, prime example. I didn't have anybody mutant. There was no mutiny last season, but there were a few phone calls of like, dude, this is like crazy. It's super long. How are we going to pull this off? And it's like, that's like, take a deep breath and just kind of get on with it. I think it's always going to be a combination, Jen, of like being on the lot or a lot or a hub, or, I think for younger people, for sure, that is something that is sort of imperative to networking. It's imperative for people to get out there and know your name. If you're sort of working in isolation, so maybe one supervisor knows you, or you have one or two connections, but you're trying to break into the business. I feel like that is something that maybe being around a hub of people, is great. Like the small company that I run with my partner, Will Files, and I, we have a little place up in Burbank, based out of Warner Brothers. And then we also have some stuff down at Sony. So when people come to work with us, we give them sort of a choice. They can either work from home if they want to, or we can set them up at one of those two studios. So they get a bit of that lot life. They get a little bit of sort of that energy and, and people being around people and stuff. So, yeah.
Get that connection, like build the relationships, like, oh yeah, this person was really fun to work with.
Or honestly, sometimes just other gigs, right? You're walking to lunch on the Sony lot, for instance, and some other supervisor sees you. Hey, what are you doing? Maybe could you come out? I mean, it's happened to me. I've gotten gigs that way and stuff. So I mean, it's important. It really is important to make, the community is an interesting, and then it's not just sound, but I think the community in general is sort of like, everybody wants to be part of something, but they also want to be detached from something and be sort of on their own. And I think media and social sort of allows that to sort of happen, where you can kind of swoop in where you kind of want to and be around and be present. And then you can kind of swoop out and do your own thing, but there's nothing like having everybody on a mix stage. I mean, that's when a lot of the magic all comes together, all the hard work that you've done on your own. Come down to the mix and let's hang out. And one of the favorite parts for me is sort of the second and third week of a final mix, because all the pieces are together, all the parts are there, the real score is there, the real dialogue is in, and you've had maybe one or two passes of the movie and you're starting to feel stuff out. But then you get into week 2 or 3 And that's when ideas start sort of firing. And that's when sort of like, oh, what if we did this? What if we did that? So, that's the sort of payoff. So yeah, of course you should come down and be part of the final mix if you can be, because why, if not, you're just sort of working in a vacuum. And
Yeah.
who wants to do that, even if you're doing
Yeah.
even if you're doing the coolest work ever. But it's an interesting time. I have really talented people that don't even live near me. They live remote, and they're perfectly happy just to do great, cool, rad stuff and send it in, and that's a cool part of it as well. You can use them as sort of the audio sniper or sound design sniper sort of thing, right? Like, work on this stuff, and I think a lot of people do that nowadays, where it's like, this person's really good at this stuff, and then this team is going to take care of these things, and that's awesome. I mean, that's what technology has afforded us to do.
Awesome. Very cool. Well, I can't wait to hear the next project that you're working on. So Stranger Things, season 5.
Season
And I
5's a
think you'll have
while
a
away. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. 5's a while away. I'm working on a few other things right now and stuff, and all very exciting things. And again, just very fortunate to stay busy and be working with great filmmakers and collaborators.
Awesome. Well, Craig, thank you so much for taking some time to have this chat with me today. I really appreciate you participating in AirCon. So thank you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Jen. Anytime.
Awesome.